So Atypical, that show, having Sheldon from the Big Bang Theory, like these were the images in my head of what autism looked like. And I'm someone who's kind of deeply relational and quite empathetic. Like I feel people's emotions pretty intensely. And that didn't add up to the story I had in my head about what autism looked like.
Megan, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
It's good to have you. Are you autistic?
Yeah.
How did you come to find that out?
I discovered it, well, this is kind of a common story now for the lost generation, which is the child to parent pipeline. So I discovered it after we were exploring this for one of my children. And the thing that's a little bit unique about my story is I was also at that time graduating with a doctorate in psychology. And so I was quite shocked when I started learning about autism in girls, and I started learning about autism in women, and discovered pretty quickly that all of a sudden my life made sense. And my training to become a psychologist did not prepare me to see that or learn that. So that's where I entered the conversation.
When you first got your result that you might be autistic, did you believe it?
So that's complex. There's kind of two snapshots in my story I could tell. So one snapshot would go back to 2017 when it was my first year in the doctoral program. And part of when you're training to become a psychologist, we learn how to do personality assessments. So in doing that, we first do them on ourselves. And I was looking at the printout of an assessment that I had received. And one of the recommendations on there was to look into the possibility of autism. And when I saw that, I kind of scoffed at it. And I just disregarded it. I was like, there's no way I'm autistic. And I also felt negative feelings toward that word. Like seeing that on the paper made me uncomfortable. So back in 2017, I didn't believe it. And I didn't even consider it again. Now, fast forward to 2021, when we started exploring this for my daughter. At that point, I had been doing depth work, psychoanalytic and psychodynamic therapy for a long time. And I had been uncovering that there's a lot of pieces of my life that didn't make sense and didn't line up. So at that point, when I started diving into autism in girls and autism in women, I was very open to it because all of a sudden there was this lens that opened up that explained so much of my life that had been a mystery up to that point. So at that point, I was receptive to the idea. And I actually self-identified as a psychologist who had access to a lot of psychological information about myself. And then I went through the process. So by the time I went through the formal process, I'd actually already come to embrace this about myself.
Why do you think that you first wrote it off when you first got the test? Do you think you had certain stereotypes of what it means to be autistic that kind of made you think you don't have it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, our cultural archetype of autism is very narrow. It tends to be men, and not just men, but it tends to be, white cis men. It tends to be, but beyond that, men that have a very stereotypical presentation and very kind of standard range of interests. And so I've actually worked with and met many men who also don't see themselves in the stereotype. So it's not as simple as like, well, women and genderqueer people don't see themselves in the archetype, because there's actually a lot of men, maybe they're hyper empathetic, or their special interest is sports or work. So they often will also not see themselves in the stereotype. But yeah, absolutely. Having the kind of, so Atypical, that show, having Sheldon from the Big Bang Theory, like these were the images in my head of what autism looked like. And I'm someone who's kind of deeply relational and quite empathetic. Like I feel people's emotions pretty intensely. And that didn't add up to the story I had in my head about what autism looked like.
The empathy piece is really interesting. One thing we can talk about is cognitive empathy, and another is affective empathy. What are the differences between those?
Yeah, so cognitive empathy would be more of that perspective-taking ability to perceive, okay, this is this person's experience, and so being able to get into kind of this perspective of another person. And then affective empathy is more on that felt emotional level of that felt experience.
My understanding is that sometimes autistic people are thought to be lacking in affective empathy, so not having the emotions of empathy, but that this might be a misunderstanding coming about because sometimes they don't realize what someone else's situation is, that they may not be reading that someone is needing empathy at this moment or that someone is sad or suffering, et cetera. What do you think about that?
So I think what I'm more familiar with is actually the flipped, where it's sometimes talked about as autistic people have less cognitive empathy, but can have similar levels of affective empathy. And then, okay, so...
So just to clarify that. So what I mean is I think people sometimes misinterpret it as though autistic people have less affective empathy.
Okay.
Because they confuse the lack of cognitive empathy for the lack of affective empathy. Does that
Got
make
it.
sense?
That does make sense. Yes. So that does happen a lot. So when people say things like autistic people don't have empathy, we've got to get a lot more nuanced with it. So it might be true that we do struggle a little bit more with the perspective taking, although that is actually also on the table around the whole theory of mind. Theory of autism has had a lot of critiques, understandably. And there's actually an autistic sociologist who put out the idea of the double empathy problem, that it's not that autistic people struggle to have empathy it's a two-way street. So in the same way that you might struggle to experience my frame of mind, I'm going to struggle to experience your frame of mind because we have very different neurological makeups. And so even the question around cognitive empathy, that's also kind of on the table being reconsidered. Now, I would say I do think there is some research pointing toward the fact that perspective taking is a little bit harder for us. I will say for myself, perspective taking is a little bit harder for me. I do have what I call long form math that I do to get to perspective taking. So that's just, there's some debate around that. But absolutely, the affective empathy piece is people will often assume that because of the perspective taking piece is harder, that also means lower affective empathy. There is, I don't know how much of a research dump you want. There's also research that suggests and that has been able to tease out that when you factor in the alexithymia, so alexithymia is difficulty identifying and experiencing our emotions. And about 1 in 10 people in society have this. It's a personality trait. It's not something you diagnose.
And it's referring to your own emotion, right? So it's about self-perception, not about other people. Yeah.
Yeah, but when you struggle to perceive your own emotions, it means you're also going to struggle to have empathy toward others because you don't have a reference point as much. And so alexithymia is tied with lower empathy. Now, about 50% of autistic people have alexithymia and sometimes severe alexithymia. So when they've looked at studies that have teased out autistic people with alexithymia and autistic people without, we see that it is actually the alexithymia that influences the empathy, not the autism.
That's very interesting. It is true, though, that on certain specific tasks, autistic people struggle more, such as given a scenario saying, what did this person intend when there's like a hidden meaning or implied meaning? Is that not true?
That's absolutely true. Like the way you all neurotypicals communicate is really strange. There's like a secret language that you all often use that we are much more likely to miss. There's this idea of context insensitivity, or it's sometimes referred to as context blindness, but I prefer the term context insensitivity, where we don't subcortically pick up some of the context in the same way that non-autistic or allistic brains do. So we might analytically try to decode what you're saying, but if there's a double meaning, many of us will miss it unless we've learned how to decode it. But it can be really confusing. Like for me, the opposite will sometimes be true of, I will overread into people's statements because I learned at some point that people often don't mean what they say and say what they mean. So if someone gives me a compliment, I have to start decoding it to, are you actually critiquing me? And am I missing that? So it can be really confusing because our communication style is very direct, kind of matter of fact. We say what we mean, and we mean what we say. And that is not the way that the world mostly operates.
Yeah, I've heard autistic people express a lot of frustration around the way non-autistic people use innuendos and kind of beat around the bush and kind of imply things. And they're like, can't you just say the thing? Why don't you just tell me what you want? It would be so much easier.
And I think this is why we actually make really good comics, because we can get up on stage and we can say the thing and people laugh, because actually when we say the thing, I think everyone breathes a little bit. Well, it depends on what the thing is, but for a lot of us, it can kind of bring a collective sigh of relief when someone is willing to say the thing.
I did an episode quite a while ago about sort of directness in communication and how there can be trade-offs, right? By being overly direct, you can sometimes, for example, hurt people's feelings or give information that really maybe is not ideal to express. If someone says, hey, do you want to come over to my party on Tuesday? And you really don't want to go, right? It's like non-autistic people are going to be very tempted to sort of say something that sort of doesn't at all hint that they don't want to go, but that they just, I'm just busy that night or whatever, right? And so I'm wondering, do you feel that sometimes that expression of like being very forthright actually can get you in trouble?
Oh, for sure. Like definitely, especially in the workplace before I knew I was autistic, I look back like over explaining, giving more information than I needed to, giving more context than I needed to. And I was, especially when I was navigating systems where there's a lot of kind of cover CYOA, like cover your own, like protection type things where you don't say things directly. I definitely that got me in trouble a few times. And I was always confused why, because I value authenticity and honesty quite a lot. And so navigating systems and workplaces has always been really difficult for me.
Yeah, I imagine corporate politics must be quite difficult.
Yeah, I don't do it.
The behavior at work is one example where getting the label of, I'm autistic, helped you understand what was going on. And I'm wondering, are there other cases you can think about in your past that suddenly made sense when you got that diagnosis?
So much. It's hard to know where to start. I think I'll start with kind of my day-to-day experience of self and relationships. So part of what I had been working through in therapy at that point was this feeling of like, I just can't get into my experience. I can't get into my life. And I've had that pervasive experience since I was very, very young of...
What does that mean? I can't get into the experience?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it feels like I'm disconnected from my experience. And most specifically, when I am out of the house and when I'm around people and what I can now say is when I'm sensory overloaded. But I didn't have that language. I didn't have that understanding. So even as a little girl, I remember going to the grocery store and I would tug at my mom and I'd say, Mom, I feel like I'm in a dream. Is this a dream? Looking back, I can tell that what I was describing was low-grade dissociation. And so much of my life, like the moments in life that you're supposed to, treasure and enjoy, like your wedding day or having a child and like these big days or graduations, these were the times where I would feel the most disconnected from myself and from the people around me. And so struggling to get into those experiences has always been a pain point for me. And it wasn't until I understood I was autistic and that I have pretty significant sensory processing differences that mean that if I'm in a room of more than 4 people, if I'm in an environment that's not sensory controlled, I will sensory shut down. So that's low-grade dissociation and get very disconnected from myself, get disconnected from others, get disconnected from my experience. And I didn't understand that. I didn't understand why I couldn't get into my life. And that was a huge one to be able to understand from a sensory lens of, yeah, it's because you're sensory overloaded and you're shut down and you're dissociated as you move through the world. So that would be one. There's others, but I'll pause there. That would be one of the things.
No, that's a great example. So we've kind of touched on sort of the emotional aspects and we touched on sensory aspects. Are there any other kind of very different aspects of your experience that kind of clicked in once you got the diagnosis?
I would say relational. Like I, at times, have had deep, intense friendships, but then struggle to maintain those friendships. And groups have always been hard for me. And I never understood why. Like moving through middle school or high school, I'd be on the sports team. I'd be in these groups. And I would see this thing happen where the others in the group would just go deeper, and I'd be kind of stuck on the outside. And so not being able to cultivate the sorts of relationships that I desired, that has also been a theme throughout my life. Or just feeling slightly out of sync and out of rhythm of the people around me, but not understanding why. That, and there was a lot of grief in that. And so having a lens for that, that's been huge as well. I also think my relationship to my interests, my most autistic trait is special interests and monotropic focus, where I go into what my spouse calls the vortex, and I can just spend hours and hours and hours in there. And there's a lot of intensity around that, which I channeled into academia. And first I channeled into religion when I was religious, and then I channeled into academia. And so it's kind of praised in those cultures, but it can make relationships a little bit challenging as well when all you want to do is connect around your interests. So my relationship to interest and desire is also something that all of a sudden made a lot more sense.
Going back to the relational for a moment, do you know why, in retrospect, you had trouble clicking with people in the same way that others did? Do you think it was that you were missing social cues or something else?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some missing of social cues, as my spouse will point out to me. So sometimes I'm not even aware of, and he'll be like, "Yeah, that was a weird thing you did." I'm like, "Oh, okay." So definitely a bit of missing social cues was in the mix. I think more so. So I was someone who learned to mask probably at a young age. Like I was a little social scientist. I would study people and notice what worked for them. So it's also just that I wasn't showing up authentically socially. And it's hard to connect with people when you're not showing up authentically. And then I did okay in places that had structure. So I think that's why I did a lot of school and grad school. I kept going back to school, and I think it's because it gave me a really structured environment, and we connected around ideas, not that social-based conversation of like, tell me about yourself, who are you, how was your weekend, all of that obnoxious stuff. So in very specific environments like academia, I was able to do okay. But outside of that, when socializing becomes more fluid, that's where I would start to struggle, because things like small talk, spontaneous socializing where you don't know what to expect, or there's not a purpose to the conversation, that sort of communication has always been so much harder for me. And the way I accommodate that is if I can pivot back to a topic of interest, that's how I can get comfortable. But especially for women, there's a lot of social-based interaction around questions about who you are and your family. And that kind of conversation has never felt very comfortable to me.
Now, on the special interest front, the stereotype would be like being obsessed with trains and memorizing, train time schedules and things like that. I imagine there's a much more diverse kind of representation of special interest that occurs. How would you describe, like, what is a special interest, and kind of what's the sort of different ways it tends to manifest?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a tricky one because everyone has interests, but the intensity of it in autistic people is pretty unique. I think of it as a sort of lens. Like when I have a special interest, I am seeing the whole world through that lens. So maybe my spouse is talking about European football, and I'll somehow connect it back to neurodivergence and autism, and I'll be like, oh, well, that connects to this idea. Partly because it's just that is the lens I have of the world in almost every interaction. It's just there. So for autistic people, special interests tend to be deeply connected to our identity. They're very soothing. So we'll often, even if we aren't engaged in the thing, we'll be thinking about the thing or daydreaming or thinking about when we can get back to that thing and back to that learning. And so the intensity of it is what is unique. And also, like when we're doing assessments, one of the things we look at is impact. Like, is it impacting things like your sleep, or are you kind of closing out other people in order to spend more time with your interests? But like you said, interest can vary a lot. And that goes back to that stereotype. The stereotype of autism is that these are bizarre interests. But it's either, like in the diagnostic criteria, it's either atypical, like in kind of the content of it, or in intensity. And so it's the folks who have a special interest that culturally blends in, but that's really intense, that I think those are some of the people most likely to be missed, especially if we make a career out of it, because that's not as obvious if we've made a career out of our special interest.
I think the point you said about it kind of bleeding into other things is really interesting, where, yeah, everyone has interests, right? But it sounds like for you, or for autistic people broadly, it tends to kind of be a lens on which they view the rest of the world. And maybe that's not so common for non-autistic people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's how I would describe my experience. And other autistic people I've talked to have connected with that. I'm not sure if that's every autistic person's experience, but yeah, it's the ecosystem of which, and then every information or idea that comes in, it comes in and I connect it to part of my ecosystem, because that's how I'm understanding the world at that moment.
Let's talk about the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria. It seems like there are two kind of large umbrella pillars, and then there are different items underneath that. So the first pillar is persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction. And then the first item underneath that would be deficits in social emotional reciprocity. So what does that mean in kind of lay terms?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, criteria A is all about the social communication. And so the reciprocity piece, this can show up in a lot of different ways. For example, the back and forth flow of a conversation, especially in small talk, that spontaneous talk is going to be harder versus if it's structured. This can also, one way this can show up is groups can be really hard. And part of that has to do with a lot of us are deeper, slower processors. So like if I'm in a group context, by the time I've absorbed what is happening and then put a thought together to respond, the conversation's already like 4 steps ahead. So that's part of what can be challenging about that, but just knowing how to enter the fluidity of a group conversation. So you might hear a lot of autistic people say, well, I do fine one-on-one, but once it's more than one-on-one, it gets really hard. So that's one way reciprocity can show up. Also through things like introduction, like the saying hi and saying bye and compliments. Like compliments are so awkward for me, and knowing that if you compliment me, I'm supposed to compliment you. And then again, a lot of us have learned these rules. So I've learned if someone compliments me, there's an expectation I compliment them back, and that we're doing some kind of weird social bid dance there. But that's not necessarily an intuitive response I would have. So reciprocity can show up in a lot of ways.
It's funny you mentioned the reciprocity, because when I did the episode with someone with narcissism who has NPD, he was describing how he uses that fact. He'll give someone a compliment knowing that it'll cause him to give a compliment back, which raises his ego. So I just think it's just fascinating, difference there.
So that is interesting, because I think, and then autistic people, many of us, not all, have kind of sensitivity around anything that feels manipulative or demand. So if someone gives me a compliment, I actually am annoyed I have to compliment them back, because it's like, I see what you're doing, and now I have to do this thing, and now we're doing some weird like social dance that I didn't even want your compliment because it made me blush because I don't like being perceived. So I have and it's interesting because I actually think autistic people and folks with NPD sometimes pair up. And so that would be kind of a cruel dynamic if the person with NPD is eliciting compliments from an autistic person.
Well, it's a little bit like you're seeing through the matrix, right? Like you're instead of like just going with the flow, like, non-autistic people do, where they're just sort of vibing, you're like seeing what's happening a little more explicitly, which kind of can change the nature of an interaction if you're kind of aware of what's happening. Like, you think about an example of like social hierarchy, right? Like maybe there's a really rich person and everyone's kissing up to them. Like being too aware of that kind of makes it very awkward and weird, right?
Totally. And then there's, it makes me anxious. Like I want to be like, y'all, do you see what's happening here? And I'll do that. So when I worked as a therapist, I was a very interpersonal therapist where I'm breaking into the meta of like, what's happening here? And that is where I get kind of psychological safety in a conversation, when we can break through the performance and talk about what's actually happening here right now. Like, why are we complimenting each other? Why are we talking about this thing?
Okay, so the next item is deficits in nonverbal communicative behaviors. So what does that mean in a kind of layer terms?
Yeah, so that can be both expressive or receptive, meaning both in how we express our nonverbal, but also how we receive and interpret other people's. So, for example, things like a tendency to have a flat affect, or even sometimes a disconnection between what we're saying and what our bodies are doing. So, for example, I was a theater kid, and I spent a lot of my childhood and adolescence looking into the mirror, practicing facial expressions. And left to my own devices, my face is very flat, and I've learned how to perform interest or perform emotion. So that would be the expressive part of this piece. And then the receptive part would be being able to intuitively understand other people's nonverbals. And again, there's going to be people who mask and who are analytically, so through their prefrontal cortex, they're analytically doing this. So for example, I've learned when someone crosses their arms, it means a certain thing. When someone's doing something with their eyes, it means a certain thing. But it's an exhausting process because you're having to use your prefrontal cortex to do all that. There's a test online where it's the eyes test, and where you look through it and you guess the emotion of it. And for me, I can kind of analytically sort it. And then my spouse did it, and he's like, I just feel what they're feeling. And like, I have no reference point for what that would be like.
Okay. And then the last item here is deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships.
Yeah. So that gets into relationships there's a lot to navigate with relationships, and even the kind of the bid for connection. So remembering to text someone on their birthday, or like thinking through that that's important to some people, or knowing, is this an acquaintance or is this a friendship? Or knowing how to navigate conflict. And often something that can happen for a lot of autistic people, going back to the communication thing around being literal, sometimes we might do something that's offensive to someone, but we don't understand that. And so that can lead to maybe a rupture. And I think many humans feel uncomfortable around conflict, so they will sometimes not offer honest feedback. And maybe they'll do the like, oh, I'm busy, I can't come to your party. But autistic people, we're not going to pick that up. And so there can also be a history of a lot of painful endings to friendships that don't make sense to us. And so that can be a piece of it. But and there's just a lot of social energy that goes into maintaining friendship. And a lot of us have lower social batteries. And to some degree, we might have less social motivation as well. Like for me, I have fairly low social motivation. I'm pretty happy in my own world. And so that's another piece of it, is but the combination of having lower social motivation and lower social energy, and then just things that are important to other people wouldn't necessarily be important to me, like remembering to text people on birthdays or go to weddings or some of that stuff. So that can make relationships tricky.
So for that first pillar, criteria A, where does masking come in?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And that's a big change that's happened from the DSM-4 to the DSM-5, is that they included that a person might mask or camouflage these. And so that's one of the reasons that we're identifying so many more people, is that especially those with average to above average IQs, they're often doing that stand back, let me analyze, and then I'm going to move through social space through my prefrontal cortex, and I'm going to learn how to do small talk. I'm going to have scripts. For me, I would practice conversations for hours and hours just to get more fluid with it. And so everything we just walked through, it might not be observable to someone who's just looking at someone's behavior. You have to look into the person's internal experience to get a sense of how hard are they working to move through that small talk or to engage in that with another person socially. And so masking is a huge piece when we look at criteria A, because a person might not, quote unquote, look autistic in the classic sense in that way.
This is reminding me of another episode we did with completely different type of neuroatypicality, which was on ASPD, antisocial personality disorder, colloquially known as being a sociopath. And my guest there described how she had to learn lots of social behaviors that they didn't make sense to her naturally. She didn't have them intuitively. So she had to basically study people and figure out how do you act, even if it didn't really make sense to her, and eventually became good enough at it that it would prevent her from sticking out and from people being able to realize that she's not like them.
I mean, that sounds identical to autistic masking. That's exactly what it is. Yeah.
And it's just interesting how it's the same behavior, but it's born out of really different type of brain difference or mind difference, right? Like, I don't think that sociopaths and autistic people really have that much in common in terms of what's going on, but they both are different from the mainstream, and so have to kind of learn this behavior to fit in.
Yeah, they both have to perform a certain way to fit in. Yeah.
This brings us to the second pillar, or criteria B of the DSM criteria, which is restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. And then the first one underneath that is stereotyped or repetitive motor movements.
So yes, that's referring to things like stimming or repetitive use. So repetition is really soothing for us. So stimming would be repetitively moving our bodies in a certain way. And kind of the stereotypical thing people think of is like hand flapping, but it can look a lot of different ways, like pacing, or it can be, especially if we're masking, it might be quieter. We might have adjusted with quieter stems. It can also be like auditory stimming. Like I'll listen to the same song on repeat, often for a week or two on end. That's actually a form of stimming. And it's because my brain knows exactly what to expect when I'm doing that repetition. Or it could also look like, rereading, and this also kind of connects to special interests, but it could look like rereading the same book or rewatching the same film, because again, our brain, that predictability is so soothing for us. And it could also look like building out collections or organizing. Like, oh my goodness, it is so soothing to build out collections of things. The systematizing, which we talked about before we started recording, that you also like systematizing. So it's like getting a lot of soothing through systematizing.
So what does it feel like when engaged in repetitive motor movements? Is it lower anxiety? Does it feel pleasant or something else?
I mean, both. So there's different kinds of stimming. So when I'm watching a stressful movie or show, like I will do the hand stimming, and it's a way of like, oh, I'm so anxious. And it's kind of a combination of anxious and excitement. And then when I'm happy, I will often stim as well. And that can feel it just feels delightful. Like it feels soothing. And then when I'm anxious, I'll sometimes stim as a way to relieve. That's when I'll do a lot of my pacing, and I'll do that as a way to relieve excess stress and anxiety. So stimming can have a lot of different emotional connections to it. It can be excitement, it can be fear, it can be a way of releasing anxiety. When I am sensory overloaded, I will want to stim more. I'll want to sway, because that's when we stim, part of what we're doing, the repetitive motor movement is helping to block out the unexpected sensory experience. So we're creating a predictable like sensory feedback loop for ourselves. So that's why it's soothing, which is also part of why masking can be detrimental, in the sense of we're not accessing the things that would actually soothe us and support us when we're navigating sensory overwhelming environments.
Interesting. I didn't realize that it was engaged in so many different emotions. I thought it was more like a stress reliever. That's fascinating. It sounds like it's more of a way of managing a variety of different emotions.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the next item there is insistence on sameness, inflexible adherence to routines, or ritualized patterns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I really like how Dr. Donna Henderson and Sarah Whalen, in their book, Is This Autism? They talk about it as islands of inflexibility. People often assume that if you're autistic, you'll be inflexible in all areas of your life, but that it's better to look for islands of inflexibility. So this could show up as like all or nothing thinking. It could show up as having a really kind of a lot of attachment to a very specific way of seeing the world, or values around, like, for example, around like maybe it could show up as social justice or justice sensitivity. And maybe it's really hard for me to be friends with people who have a different political view than me. So it could show up ideologically. It can show up in our routine. Like unexpected changes to our routine can be very anxiety inducing, and for me, it would cause a lot of irritability. And until I understood I was autistic, I just thought I was a terrible person, because it's like, well, my friend changed plans and decided to invite another friend to the social thing. And I'm now super annoyed and irritable, and I must be a terrible person that I'm so annoyed that this second person is here, right? That would be an example of the plans changed, and I wasn't prepared for that. And it's not because I'm a terrible person. It's because I wasn't expecting that. And that sort of thing can create a lot of what feels like irrational irritability in us. Now, when we understand it from an autistic lens, it's like, okay, that makes sense. You were preparing for a very specific thing and the plans changed on you.
And then the last item here is hyper or hypo reactivity to sensory input, or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. We've kind of talked about hypersensitivity, but it's interesting that it can be hypo, like less sensitivity.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's this research is a little mixed, but there's some thinking that men might be a little bit more susceptible to hypo and females might be a little bit more susceptible to hypersensitivity. But yeah, hypo would be a dulled experience. So if hyper is like not having enough of a filter, like a brain filter, so all the sensory input comes in with a lot of intensity, hypo would be like having too much of a filter. So you need to listen to the music louder to experience it, or you need more force to feel the handshake, or more flavor in the food to experience it. And so that can create different kinds of problems. For example, maybe this person's prone to eating food that's gone bad and they don't realize it's gone bad because their taste is less sensitive or their smell is less sensitive. Or they could have a really high pain tolerance and they don't go to the doctor until the infection's gotten really bad because they don't realize how sick they are. So there's different challenges that come with being hyper or hypo. And then actually it's a little bit more like a DJ board in the sense that you can be hypersensitive in some senses and hyposensitive in other senses. So getting to understand our sensory profile when you're autistic is pretty complex. There's a lot in the mix.
So would it be inaccurate to say that on average, autistic people are more sensitive to sensory input, and it's really more accurate to say they just perceive sensory input differently, sometimes more intensely, sometimes less intensely?
Yeah, probably the second, that it's common to be to have like atypical sensory processing, to have less or more. That would be probably more. And hypersensitive gets talked about more, I think, but both can absolutely be true.
So that covers all the symptoms in the DSM, but I do want to mention some of the other aspects of the criteria because I think they're interesting and shed some light on this. So the DSM says that these have to show themselves in early development period. So if you didn't have this when you were a child, but you only developed this as an adult, they actually will not count it as autistic.
Yeah, absolutely. So because it's classified as a neurodevelopmental condition, and so that means it's something you're born with. So I refer to it as a neurotype. It's my brain style. It's my nervous system. So it has to have been present in childhood. Now, if you were in an environment that was really well supported, or if there is masking, then these traits might not become. You might not be able to see them in the person's history until a bit later, and so that is part of also, and I think that's part of what they added when they added the masking and camouflaging, is that you might not see these traits until you're in environments where there is more stress. And I think, so I've heard this idea, I have kind of mixed feelings on it, but I've heard this idea that the DSM criteria is what an autistic person looks like under stress. And I think that's slightly too simplistic, but I do find something helpful about that idea. There's so much more to the autistic experience than these checkboxes we just walked through. But this is what will be more visible to other people when we are in sensory overwhelming environments, when we are in burnout. And so I think that's just a helpful lens to have on this criteria, is these things will all be more prevalent when we're struggling.
Yeah, that's a great point. And this actually leads me to the next point, which is that in order to get the autistic diagnosis, according to the DSM, these symptoms have to cause clinically significant impairment, meaning that if you had these aspects, but they didn't bother you, then it wouldn't actually be autism according to the diagnosis.
Yeah. And yes, and there's a lot there we could unpack of, like, is it possible to have the autistic neurotype but not meet criteria for autism spectrum disorder as it's classified in the DSM? Like, that's a interesting conversation to have. And so that's one thought. The other thought that I often like to highlight with that piece of the criteria is that it does include things like your emotional impact. So, for example, for a lot of folks like me who have navigated the world through masking and camouflaging, you might not see a lot of functional impairment at work or in school, but autism behind closed doors looks very, very different. And so what you wouldn't see is me laid out on the couch struggling to access speech after a day of being out in the world. Or what you don't see is the mental health conditions, the substance abuse that's really common among autistic people who navigate neurotypical spaces. So that's where also considering the emotional impact of masking and navigating the world this way and of chronic sensory overwhelm, that also becomes part of the considering when you're considering if an autism diagnosis is warranted.
It's interesting to think about how if an autistic person lived in like sort of their ideal environment that's perfectly suited to them, they probably wouldn't meet the diagnostic criteria because they would be unlikely to have a lot of negative effects from it. At least some of them would fail to meet the diagnostic criteria. But I think that's a difference between how we use these words casually and how the diagnostic criteria work, right? Casually, we're not going to say someone stops being autistic just because they live in an ideal environment where they're not suffering, right?
Well, and that also gets to, and this actually is a good point back to criteria A. So a lot of criteria A is not necessarily present when we're with each other. So there's this idea of cross-neurotype interactions. So yeah, if someone is surrounded by autistic people, they're in a very sensory controlled environment, you would still see the special interests. You'd still see some of the criteria B stuff, but it would be a lot harder to see some of this stuff, especially because of the cross-neurotype piece. So there's a study that has looked at this. Can I unpack that study briefly?
Of course, please, go ahead.
Okay. So there's been some really interesting studies that have looked at cross-neurotype interactions. And one of the studies, what they did is they played the telephone game, kind of like you did in childhood, except it was a full story. And they had two groups, or three groups. They had an allistic group, so non-autistic, just autistic people, and then they had a cross-neurotype group. And what they did is they had to tell the story to the next person. In the mixed neurotype group, it was allistic, autistic, allistic, autistic. So each time the story was being told, it was a cross-neurotype. Now, if autism is truly a deficit of social communication, you'd expect the autistic group for the communication to break down the fastest because replaying a story would be really hard. But that's not what they found. What they found is that the communication broke down at the similar levels for the allistic and autistic group and much, much faster in the cross-neurotype group. And there have been other studies that paired people based on neurotype and then looked at things like rapport and connection and found similar things where autistic people, we can actually connect with each other quite well, but it's the cross-neurotype interaction where communication breaks down. But if the prevalence rate is 2.7 or 3%, most of our interactions with the world is going to be with non-autistic people. So it's going to seem like, well, yeah, the issue is in you. But when we're with each other, we actually communicate. I mean, and I don't mean that in a global, of course we still have our communication challenges, but it's a lot easier to communicate with each other.
Yeah, it's fascinating. The last DSM criteria I want to mention is that it says these disturbances are not better explained by intellectual disability. And I think people have a lot of different and maybe even conflicting beliefs about the relationship between autism and intellectual ability or disability. On the one hand, I think some people think it's linked to lower IQ or intellectual disability. On the other hand, people talk about autistic savants and think maybe, it's actually a sign of being a genius. So yeah, what's actually going on with that link?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that you brought that up because that is a common myth I like to bust, is that either people assume it means you have an intellectual disability or that you're a savant. The reality is, as is true of any neurotype, it spans the whole intellectual spectrum. So yes, there are autistic people with co-occurring intellectual disabilities, and historically they've been identified at higher rates. So it's also hard to say what the true prevalence rate is there. And then there are autistic people who also are savants. And there's autistic people who are very average IQ and autistic people who are also gifted and have high IQs. So just like ADHD, just like autism, just like being neurotypical, it ranges the whole intellectual spectrum.
I've heard that there can be challenges with intellectual testing or IQ testing of autistic people where, for example, if you give Raven's matrices, which are essentially, these grids where you have to complete the next symbol in the pattern, autistic people often test much better, much higher than with some of the other types of IQ testing. And so it even depends on which IQ test are you leaning on And it might actually, you have to be really careful when you're testing an autistic person to choose the test carefully.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not fully caught up on all the research around this, but I do know, so processing speed is what is often lower in autistic people on IQ tests. But then you want to contextualize it because there's different processing speed, like what you just described was a processing speed test. And where some of the processing speed tests we seem to be better at than others. And that makes sense to me if you consider, like, there's so much that goes into processing speed. Like, my processing speed when I'm in an environment where there's a lot going on is going to be a lot slower. Or if I'm needing to task switch, because task switching can be harder for our brains as well as for ADHD brains. So yeah, even things like processing speed gets really nuanced. Of my processing speed's really fast when I'm in my monotropic deep focus, but when my focus is split, that's where my processing speed gets a lot slower. So I would think that would show up on an IQ test as well. And then also the literal questioning around a lot of testing throws us off.
What do you mean by that?
Well, so even for some of the measurements for autism, so like one of the questions is, do you prefer, actually, let me ask you this. I'm curious how you'd respond. It's a Friday night. Would you prefer to go to a museum or a party?
Party.
See, okay, do you want to know what my brain does? How did you get there? First, how did you get there?
I visualized myself in each of the events, and then I thought about which one, like, did I feel like I was having more fun at?
Okay. So what my brain goes to is like, well, what museum, what kind of party? And then it's like, I can't answer that question. I don't have enough context.
You're a survey maker's worst nightmare because it's so interesting because like we design a lot of surveys and we regularly we will get people who have exactly the complaint that you have. They'll be like, well, but I can't answer this unless I know more information. But it's really fascinating because like 95% of people don't even like think about that. They just answer it.
So this is context insensitivity, which that word comes from Dr. Donna Henderson, which this is, I think, such a big part of the autistic experience that gets missed is when you don't automatically pick up that context. It's like, well, give me the context. Tell me what museum, tell me what party. Your brain, I don't know what it did or how it did it, but how did you pick what museum and what party to imagine yourself in?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, my system one, my gut, generated a scene where I was imagining some specific museum, although it wasn't actually a real museum. Like it was just a visualization of some museum, and I imagined myself there, and then I imagined myself at some party. So it's kind of picking some kind of prototype, right? And it's not thinking about like, well, which museum is it? It's just sort of like, here's a prototype of each, and then like, which should I feel happier at? Yeah,
that's wild that your brain just did that. That's fascinating.
And I don't know if other people's brains would do it differently. I really don't know because but it's certainly my brains do it differently. Yeah.
Can I ask you another one?
Definitely.
What's your favorite book?
Okay. Yeah, I got it. I would say probably Thinking Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman.
Okay. Would you answer that the same no matter who asked you that? Like if you're...
Probably, yeah. I don't think it would depend on that. Yeah. Yeah. What happens, my internal experience when you ask that question is I get immediately a flash of an image in my mind that's the book cover. It just like comes to me in one moment. It's like there's no analytical processing that's happening.
So it is a great book, by the way. So that book had a big impact. Okay. So that actually feels less context. So I asked this of Donna Henderson. So Donna Henderson wrote Is This Autism? She's not autistic though, she's ADHD. And we had this conversation around this. And she was saying how if a neighbor asked her, she would probably say a fiction book because she understands that there's a bid for social connection there. And that's what she's responding to is the bid for social connection. But if a colleague asked, she'd probably say a psychology book because of the context of it's a colleague in a work setting. My brain goes to what's my favorite book. And then I'm like, well, break it down for me. Like if you asked me that, I was like, are you talking about fiction, nonfiction, psychology? Give me a bucket. And then from there, I'll think through. And I definitely would be missing the fact that there's a social bid happening if someone's asking me that. And I wouldn't think to be responding to the social bid. I'd just be responding to factually, what's my favorite book? And it's going to take me a long time because give me a bucket of what kind of book.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's funny. There have definitely been a few times in my life where people thought I was autistic. And I think it's because I have a few traits that are kind of resemble autism, although I think in most of these traits you describe, I don't think I have them at all. But one of them I do have is that I will, like when you describe that, I would never think like, oh, this is a social bit and therefore I have to adapt my response to it. I would just say the same book no matter what. I also think I tend to be like more aware of like, oh, this is this game that we're doing right now in certain situations that other people don't think that. And so it's kind of another trait that kind of makes me stand out. And also, you mentioned earlier, like facial expressivity. I think I was always less expressive in my face. And it's something I had to kind of learn to be like, to show my feelings more on my face. And so I had to like explicitly learn that, whereas other people kind of do that naturally. So just reminds me of times when people have been like, are you autistic? So
have you taken any of the screeners?
I have, yeah. I don't test high. Yeah, because I think in most of the traits I don't have them.
Yeah. And that gets to this complex, it's people often will say, and rightfully so, it's an offensive thing to say, like, oh, everyone's a little bit autistic. Like, that's just not an affirming thing to say. And there is a reality that there is a range of autistic traits. So, like, you would have perhaps higher autistic traits than other people. And we know that, like, folks who are gifted tend to have higher autistic traits. They might not, like you're saying, not reach that threshold of what we would call autism. But yeah, it's interesting.
So we've talked about these different diagnostic criteria. What would you change about the DSM, if anything, if it were up to you?
Oh, that's a huge, big, great question. So yeah, I mean, these are very much behavioral checkboxes of this is what it looks like. It misses the internal experience.
And it kind of makes sense because it's for a clinician who's like observing the person. So yeah. I find it deeply interesting to know what the internal experience is like, but maybe you could argue that from the point of view of a clinician, you want the kind of external, more observable things. What do you think?
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, I think, yeah, you're right. Like we need to have something to be able to go off of. I think that what can sometimes happen though, especially with clinicians, is we get too tied to thinking about it as a behavior and not thinking. And then what often happens is if someone can do one thing that's not stereotypically autistic, like make eye contact, what has sometimes happened is the clinician will be like, well, they can make eye contact, so they can't be autistic. So there's like, yeah, I mean, we just need some kind of markers, but there's dangers of it if we're not thinking deeply about, well, what's that person's experience of eye contact? And so that's where going deeper into the subjective experience becomes really important, because maybe they are making eye contact, but it's really uncomfortable for them. Or maybe they're looking right here in my forehead, but because they're trying to perform eye contact. So I would include more about the internal experience. I would include more about autism as a distinct nervous system. And the monotropic, I would definitely highlight the monotropic focus as an aspect of the autistic experience.
Could you explain that, monotropic?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so monotropic, it's that singular deep focus that vortex is the best word I have for it, where we tend to thrive when we're in that deep singular focus. And then when we're in environments or situations that force us to split our focus or attention, that can be really stressful for us. It can be really, it can cause a lot of anxiety to show up because there's a lot of friction around that.
I like your point about getting more at the internal reason behind the behavior, because I've definitely seen people make this mistake where they think someone doesn't have some neurotypicality because their behaviors don't resemble what they'd expect. But if you really understand the motivation, you realize it actually is representative. So going back to the episode with Jacob, the nameless narcissist, we talked about how narcissists can build other people up. Like they can give you a lot of compliments. They will often talk about how great the people they know are, and it can come across as very generous. Like, oh, they're building other people up all the time. But then if you think about, and so it's like, that doesn't seem narcissistic at all, right? But then if you think about the underlying motivation, you think, well, actually what's happening is it's part of their grandiosity. Actually, like the people I know are the best people. And if I give you a compliment, you'll give me one back, right? And then suddenly you're like, like if you get too hung up on the behavior, it can actually you can really misunderstand what's happening. You have to go to the underlying sort of intentionality behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great example.
I think another thing that can seem very mysterious to people is, what do these symptoms have to do with each other? If you're kind of sitting on high and just looking down and saying like, well, what does stimming have to do with, having trouble understanding hidden social cues, and what does hyperfixation on certain interests have to do with both of those two things? Is it just ultimately some kind of biological linkages that we don't really understand, or why did this set of things come together?
I mean, I think that's like the $1,000,000 question. People have been asking this for a long time. What is autism in the sense of that? And the fact that we don't have one single gene we can point to, right? I do think they are more connected than they are sometimes realized. And I think a lot of it does go back to that monotropic brain style and to sensory processing. For example, even going back to, so criteria A, all of that makes so much more sense, the social communication stuff, when you think about the nervous system experience of an autistic person, of if they're trying to do small talk and they're sensory overloaded, so they're in some sort of shutdown, so they don't have very good access to themselves, and monotropic focus, right? Small talk requires a lot of split focus and a lot of fast processing. So when you think about even socializing through a monotropic lens or through a nervous system lens or through a sensory lens, it's like, yeah, that makes sense that those social interactions are going to be a lot harder. So it is a lot more connected than people often realize. And there is a lot of mystery, which is why there's been so many theories around what autism is like, why do these things cluster together? How do they connect?
I have heard people talk about trying to unify autism from like a sensory lens and point out things like, what I've heard this is true, that for an autistic person, they're more likely to notice certain information and less likely to notice other information. For example, let's say there's a tag on your clothing that's been there for a while. Like non-autistic people might sort of stop thinking about it, kind of zone it out and not notice it anymore, where an autistic person might be more likely to keep noticing the tag touching their skin. Or in a conversation, or an autistic person might be less likely to notice the facial expression, where a non-autistic person may be more honed in on the facial expression. So do you kind of buy that could be a unifying lens?
I mean, I think I'm skeptical of anything that offers
Yeah.
a unifying lens, but I do think there's some truth to that idea that we pay more attention to some things and less to others. And that connects to this idea of bottom-up processing, where we tend to take in our world through the details first and then build up to a unifying theory, which also helps explain kind of how we move through the world, both cognitively as well as socially. Like that's a lot of information to be taking in, which also means we're going to miss other things. We're going to miss more of that top-down stuff, but we'll be seeing the details. So I definitely think that is a core part of the experience of being autistic that's woven into the fabric of it. I think I like to think more about what are some of the core components woven into the fabric versus one overarching theory that explains it. But maybe that's like my hierarchy stuff or demand avoidance. I'm just skeptical of theories that try to encompass all of it.
What's an example with the idea of like bottom up rather than top down processing?
Yeah, so I most feel it when I'm writing or I'm giving a presentation. So giving presentations or writing takes me so long. So for example, if you think back to like college, I don't know, what would be an essay question that a college person might receive? Like,
explain the metaphor of such and such in, Jane Eyre.
yeah,
Like that.
okay.
Yeah.
So a top-down thinker is probably going to have a few intuitive theories around that and start there, and then maybe go find research that supports it. A bottom-up thinker is going to be like, okay, let me go read Jane Eyre. Let me go, like, there's going to be a really intensive data collection process around that. So when I'm prepping a presentation, I'm going back to all of the original studies and reading them. And from the bottom, I'm finding what are the themes of the presentation going to be. And it can make it really hard to finish tasks because the bottom-up processing is so detailed and so intensive. And it can be hard to know what context is important and what isn't. Even in this conversation right now, like there's times where I'm like, well, let's talk about this study or let's do this. I'm describing the things versus synthesizing and summarizing. And that's the bottom up processing of let me describe it to you in details. And then if I keep talking enough, I'll get to the big idea.
Yeah, it sounds overwhelming potentially if you have to start at all the different facts. Like, and how do you put this together? That sounds really, really difficult to sort of build it up from tons of little facts.
It is overwhelming. And it's part of why like learning new systems and when you join a new workplace can be a lot. And by the time, so for example, if an autistic employee enters a new workplace, by the time they have integrated, they know that system so well because they've done the bottom-up processing. So even with the presentation I mentioned, I gave a presentation a few months ago and spent so many hours on it, and it was overwhelming. And all of those numbers and all of those studies are now pretty locked in my head in a way of like, I know that information so deeply.
Right. So there's a way in which it might be a benefit too, even if it has its trade-offs.
Yeah, it's both. There's benefits, there's pros and benefits to be bottom up or top down. If I'm in the middle of the street and a car's coming at me, like I'd really want to be a top down thinker and be able to like move out of the way really fast. And so there's definitely, it's not that one processing style is good and the other is bad. And then when we think about neurodiversity, we need a world of both. Like I'm really thankful for the top down thinkers in my life who can be like, Megan, Anna, that's unnecessary context. Cut that.
So I think one thing that confuses people about autism is the labeling and how it's changed over time. And my understanding is that in the 1960s is when the label began to be used, but actually was referring to childhood schizophrenia. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love walking people through the history of autism, especially, there's a lot of adults who feel understandably upset that they were missed in childhood. So I like to give people the historical context because I think it really explains the cultural moment we're in and why there is this whole lost generation of autistic adults. So yes, for most of the 20th century, autism was thought of as like child onset schizophrenia. And then it wasn't until the DSM-3 in the 1980s that it was introduced as infantile autism, but it had to be present before age 3. And the criteria was very, very strict and you had to meet all of the criteria. And then in DSM-4 in 1994, that's when we started introducing different subtypes. Aspergers was added in. So at that point, we started identifying more autistic people who did not have a co-occurring intellectual disability. And then it was in the DSM-5 in 2013 that we saw some really big changes. That's where there's, I think, 4 or 5 diagnoses that were collapsed into the autism spectrum disorder diagnosis. And then we saw a lot of criteria changes as well and a broadening of the diagnostic criteria. So the DSM-5 was the kind of the most significant diagnostic upgrade. And that's also why, so someone like me, a child of the 80s and 90s, I wouldn't have met the criteria being used back then, but I do meet the criteria that's being used now.
Do you think it's a good thing that Asperger's is no longer a diagnosis and now sort of everything's collapsed into autism spectrum disorder?
I'm going to hold off on answering if it's a good or bad thing. I will say there are mixed feelings on that in the community. I think it's really good. We've got level 1, level 2, and level 3, which signal different support needs. I know that many families who are supporting autistic people with level 3 feel that they are more prone to feel some resentment around the collapsing of the diagnosis. And I understand that. I get that. So I don't know that I would say it's good or bad. I think it's complex. I think, I don't have a strong opinion on that. I know that there are a lot of opinions on it, though.
Yeah, and I think this gets to something that is deeply confusing to a lot of people, that they might refer to someone who's autistic, who has level 3 support needs, who can't take care of themselves, needs help preparing their meals, maybe is nonverbal, can't hold a job, realistically. And then someone who is level 1, who has a PhD in physics and is writing revered papers, right? And like the same word, autistic, is being used for both of these groups. Is that helpful, or is that actually cause a lot of confusion because the needs of those two types of person are so different?
And I think you're going to get really different answers on that. And maybe it's both. I'm very aware, because I'm in the autistic advocacy space, that a lot of folks in that space are people like me who can access speech and who have more privilege. And so there is so much complexity in how we talk about this and how we signal it. And I think what I'm concerned about is when we aren't thinking enough around privilege and intersecting identities and how we're talking about autism, and when autism advocacy erases the voices of other autistic people. Like, this is something I think about a lot. I feel a lot. And maybe that's why I'm even struggling to answer this question, is I think it's really nuanced. It's really complex. And there's a lot in this conversation.
Yeah, I think it is a really difficult conversation, but also I think an important one, because you could see how, for example, let's say you're a parent of a level 3 autistic child, you could see how having others conflate autism with, the high performing, physics PhD is actually antithetical to the goals and the needs you have to get support for your child. Whereas on the other hand, you can imagine someone who's level 1 autism and people jumping to stereotypes that, oh, well, maybe they can't care for themselves because they're autistic. That's also very harmful, right? And so I could see in both cases how it could reduce their ability to have their needs met.
Yeah, I think that's really, really well said. And yeah, absolutely. And I think in an ideal world, the visibility of autistic people like me would help create awareness around, like, that there's different ways of processing sensory information, cognitive information, social information, to increase awareness of stimming, right? Because I have the privilege to do that with safety, so that the next time someone with high support needs, who's non-speaking and perhaps Black or brown, has a meltdown in public, there's more awareness of what stimming is. And maybe that person doesn't get shot. And maybe that person survives that. That, to me, would be the best outcome of the combined language of autism, is when those of us who can more safely be more visible increases awareness around things like stimming and actually makes the world safer for those with higher support needs. Unfortunately, what often happens is this kind of weird, and we're seeing this right now with everything that's happening in the news cycle. When RFK said what he said, part of the community's response was, well, I pay taxes, look at what I can do. And that's actually really, well, it's frankly a response that comes from a space of ableism and is harmful, because it's saying, I matter because I can do these things. And that is a very divisive response. I think a response is, all autistic people matter because they are people. And so to respond to RFK's comments as, well, I matter because I can do X, Y, Z, that's really damaging to the autistic community, especially those with higher support needs. So I think when autism is combined into a community, there are ways it could mutually benefit everyone, like making stimming more awareness around things like stimming, which makes the world safer for everyone. But then you see the flip side, where people say things like that, where they say, autism is not a disability. That's a really unhelpful thing to say, frankly. And that makes the world harder for those with higher support needs. So a lot of it's about how I think that's why I was struggling to answer the question. It's not just if it's combined, it's how, as a community, as an autistic community, are we showing up? Are we considering those with different support needs, especially those of us with lower support needs? Are we considering them in the conversation and how we show up? So I think it could be a benefit. I think it could also be a detriment.
This also ties into this controversy around the concept of curing autism, which, if you can totally understand the point of view of a parent who's a level 3 autistic child. They could see their child is suffering tremendously, needs constant help and support to do basic things. And you could see why they would say, of course we want a cure for autism. Like, my child's suffering. Why would we not want a cure? And then on the other hand, you could see someone with level 1 autism who really thinks of what they have as a difference, not a disability. And they're just like, well, I process things a different way. And if society were a little bit different, I wouldn't have to suffer at all. Or if I, found the right friend group and then the right job, I could, my difference doesn't make me suffer. I only suffer insofar as sort of I'm forced to deal with certain things in the world that hopefully I can avoid, right? And so you could see actually those seem to me like both totally valid perspectives, but unfortunately they're completely at odds with each other in a sense.
That's where I hope the autistic community can create space for nuance. depending on how your autism looks for you and your experience of it, you're going to relate to it really differently. Even in our language choice, like you asked me, do you want autistic or with autism? Like, because of my experience of my autism, I embrace it with pride. But that's not going to be everyone's experience. And some people are going to wish that they didn't have this. And I think that is the complexity that the autistic community is being asked to hold right now of, can we honor both experiences without invalidating one another? That for some people, if they were given the option to take a pill and not have autism, they would. And that for some of us, we would say, no, thank you. And that both can be valid responses to this experience of being autistic.
It does make me wonder whether having one word to lump it all together just makes it sound more complicated. Whereas if there were more words, maybe it would be a little bit easier to talk about. But it's like, well, if it's all just autistic spectrum disorder, it's, there's so much in that bucket. It also makes me think that the phrase spectrum is very confusing, right? What is when you hear the phrase spectrum and autistic spectrum disorder, I think about a line, right? Like you can be on one end or the other. Is that actually what's intended, or is it not really a spectrum?
Again, you're going to see some debate on this. The alternative to the spectrum, so the critique of that is this idea of we can't be less or more autistic, is the common critique to that. One alternative framework that's been introduced is this idea of wheels of traits, and like you can have more or less. So maybe you'd have more sensory sensitivities, but maybe less of the communication stuff, or more of the special interest energy, but less of this. And I do like the movement toward the wheel of traits, just in that it captures how of a diverse experience it can be. At the same time, I am sensitive to folks who want to kind of too messily clump us together and in a way that erases the conversation around support needs, because I do think that is such an important nuance to always hold on to around, because again, it's going to influence our experience of ourselves and of the world. So yeah, that's another one of those complex pieces.
You mentioned earlier the lost generation. Tell us more about that.
I mean, I could talk all day on that. So yes, the lost generation, that refers to people, a lot of folks who were born kind of mid-1990s or after. We know that people who were born, I think it was after, or people who were born after 1998 are 4 times more likely to have received an autism diagnosis by the age of 18 than those born like a decade earlier. So if you're born in the 80s or 90s, then you likely wouldn't have been identified in childhood, somewhere. And the interesting thing about this generation is that many of us are actually seeking mental health treatment. So that's one of the things about level 1 autistic folks is we do have less of the traditional support needs, and then we tend to have pretty high mental health support needs. So many of us have anxiety, depression, OCD, personality disorders, and many of us have an experience of going to therapy and having unsuccessful course of treatments, partly because our underlying base neurology is missed. So there's an interesting study that came out of Sweden. Johan Nyrinus looked at this, where they looked at people who were seeking outpatient psychiatric care. And they found that 18.9% of them were autistic. Do you want to take a guess how many of them were identified or had a diagnosis?
I'm going to guess very low.
Yeah, 0.053%.
Wow, that's really low.
So this is just one study in one country, but that would mean 1 in 5 people seeking psychiatric care in that population was undiagnosed autistic adult. And so that matters because the mental health needs can be quite high, and the risks around suicide are incredibly, incredibly high. So there's a whole generation out there who tends to be struggling quite a bit with their mental health and perhaps even seeking treatment, but their autism is completely missed.
When we see really quickly rising rates of something, which we've seen for autism in the kind of official estimates, 3 things could be happening, right? Number 1, it could be that the diagnostic criteria have been loosened, right? So that it applies to more people. The second is that we could be better at screening. So more people are getting correctly diagnosed, but before that, people weren't being screened. And number 3 is that the actual rates of the underlying condition could be rising. Like more people could be actually becoming autistic. And I've heard, people have different claims about this. And some people think that actually, something in the water is making, raising the rates of autism, or who knows what. Do you think there's any evidence that the actual underlying rate of autism is rising? Or do you think it's attributable to the definition being being loosened over time and better screening?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I don't want to fall into binaries. So I don't want to be like, there's no true prevalence rising. It's possible. But when I look at the statistics, what shouts out to me is the historical context. That's really, we've always been here. We're just much better at identifying us. So there's so many things that have been implemented, like the DSM that we just walked through. The diagnostic criteria has broadened quite a bit. We have gotten a lot better at identifying girls and women and genderqueer people and racialized autistic people. And so we're also getting better at identifying underrepresented groups. There's more screening. So in 2006, 2007, the American Pediatric Association started implementing routine screening or recommending routine screening for children. There were more education incentives for families to get a diagnosis because there was more supports in the school system when a child had this diagnosis. So there's like social incentive to seek out. And then there's been so much awareness work around what autism can look like beyond those stereotypes that we mentioned. So, and then clinicians are also slowly, very slowly, getting more aware of autism. So there's so much historical social context that feeds into those rise of autism rates that we're seeing and that we're hearing about in the news cycles right now. Yeah, sure, true prevalence might be in the mix, but much more so, I would say, are these other factors that have contributed to those rises.
And of course, we live in a world where some people blame it on vaccines. I like the quote from, I believe it was from Jacob Appel, the bioethicist, who said, vaccines are pretty much the only thing we can be positive don't cause autism, because we study it so much. And without everything else, you can't be as sure. So,
yeah, yep.
Now, you mentioned better understanding of autism in women. Does autism present differently in women, and in what sort of ways?
So anyone can mask or camouflage. And I always get a little bit tongue-tied talking about this because I am hesitant to perpetuate any of the gender binary, especially because a lot of autistic people actually don't identify with the gender binary. But what
is that more common among autistic people to be non-binary? Yeah.
Yeah, to be either trans or non-binary or otherwise genderqueer. It's I think it's like I used to have the stats in my head, but I think it's like 3 to 6% more common to be. It's either 3 or 6 times more common to be autistic when you're trans, or the inverse of that, to be trans when you're autistic. But yeah, it's quite a bit higher. So yes, we weren't very good at identifying the girls, and that's partly because we didn't understand autistic masking and camouflaging, and they are much more likely to mask and to camouflage and to do that thing where they're the social scientists who are just studying their friends and then mimicking. And then the other thing, because of, I would say, gender bias, we might code their behaviors differently. Like, oh, that girl's oversensitive, or she's being bossy. And so it's also how we're coding that. And then girls also seem to be more prone to internalize. And so maybe their stimming looks like self-harm, or they're more likely to have some of those internalized disorders around anxiety or depression, or it might show up as an eating disorder. Some of that repetitive and ritualistic behavior might morph into an eating disorder. So then that can lead to diagnostic overshadowing, because we're seeing the anxiety and the social anxiety and the eating disorder, but the autism gets missed as part of that. And then girls, it's thought that girls are more likely to have social interests that culturally blend in. And also just the measurements. Like the measurements ask about, do you like line up trains? It doesn't ask, do you line up dolls? So there's a lot of reasons that we've historically been missing the girls.
From that point of view, the kind of common wisdom that, what does it say, that like 3 times more men or 4 times more men are autistic than women? Do you think that might be an inflated number because we're missing women?
Absolutely. So this research is a little bit old now, but this was, I think, in the early 2000s. There's a study that looked at this. And when you look at, so the 4 to 1 is the ratio that's often cited. I think it's 3 to 1 now. But when you looked at autistic people with intellectual disabilities. The ratio was 2-1, meaning 2 boys for every autistic girl. And then when you look at the population that did not have a co-occurring intellectual disability, it jumps to 9-1, which suggests it wouldn't make sense that the true prevalence would shift that much. What does make sense is that we really didn't know how to catch girls that did not have a co-occurring intellectual disability. So absolutely, I think that number is not reflective of true prevalence. There's one study, again, it's just one study, one sample size. It was done by a pediatrician in Australia just a couple years ago. And what he found was that 80% of autistic females were undiagnosed and remained undiagnosed by the age of 18. And in his study, the ratio was 3-4, meaning 3 autistic boys to 4 autistic females, or 3 autistic males to 4 autistic females. Now, that's not been replicated. That's the only study I've ever seen that suggests more autistic females to males, but that does exist, which is pretty fascinating. So I think really we don't know the true prevalence ratio because there have just historically been so many females that we've missed and we are missing.
You mentioned how co-occurring anxiety and depression can sometimes mask a diagnosis. I've also heard there can be an overlap with ADHD. What's the connection between ADHD and autism?
Hi, and I'm Audi ADHD, which means I'm autistic and ADHD, and so the prevalence studies, as I'm sure you know, they can be all over the place, and so it's hard to predict. But the prevalence studies suggest what looks like a pretty high overlap of the two, and they do share some genetic markers. So even a parent who's ADHD might be more likely to have an autistic child, and vice versa. So we do know there's some genetic overlap there, but I think there's still a lot we're understanding about the relationship there.
Probably the vast majority of people with ADHD don't have autism, though. Is that correct?
Okay. So the numbers are less. The percentages are less. I feel like I've seen, and again, I almost don't want to do it because the prevalence studies are all over the place, but I've seen like 60% of autistic people have ADHD, and for ADHD, it's like maybe 20 to 30% also meet criteria for autism. However, the thinking is there's actually probably a lot of ADHDers who might be autistic, but they're doing the diagnostic overshadowing. So socializing is hard for them. And they're like, oh, well, that's my ADHD. So that's something where, and it's pretty new. It wasn't until 2013, till the DSM-5, that you could actually diagnose both. So understanding the experience of both ADHD and autism together is still relatively new. So I don't think we actually know yet. But I would suspect that it's lower. It's more common for autistic people to also have ADHD than for ADHD people to also be autistic. But they do seem to co-occur a lot. And also just that makes sense because there's more of the population that's ADHD. Like it's like 9% right now, and it's like 3% for autism.
How do you feel about self-diagnosis? Because I think this is an increasing concern people have, that as these ideas, it's great that people become more aware of these ideas, but also can mean that people can jump to conclusions about themselves. And I saw one study that was kind of interesting that suggested that some of the people that self-diagnose as autism may be more introverts with more social anxiety, which maybe could seem like autism in certain ways, but doesn't necessarily mean it's autism.
Yeah, so this is another big conversation point. And I almost feel like we have to have 2 conversations, which one conversation is around access to identification and diagnosis, and the fact that especially for adults, there's just so many barriers, and around, especially the more marginalized you are, the more barriers there are to accessing diagnosis or accessing someone who even understands how to assess you. So I feel like I can't fully chime in on or critique the self-diagnosis or self-identification until we've addressed the fact that there's very real issues in people being able to access diagnosis. So I like to have those conversations in dialectic with one another. There have been some studies that have pointed toward that when people self-identify and when people are medically diagnosed, like when they're both included in the same study, their data looks very similar, which I think is interesting. So I am a proponent of self-identification in the sense that many people just don't have access to a diagnosis. At the same time, I am also cautious of, if someone is hopping on social media and looking at a few reels and be like, oh, I connect to that, I'm autistic. Like, yeah, I don't think that's going to be very helpful for them, in the sense that maybe it's something else. Maybe it's social anxiety and there's treatment for that. Maybe it's bipolar and there's treatment for that. Most autistic people are not going to self-identify that way. They're going to see a reel. It's going to become a special interest. They're going to do the bottom-up processing. They're going to read the research articles. They're going to read things like Donna Henderson's book. They're going to seek out autistic voices. And through typically hours and hours and weeks of self-exploration, they will come to this. And I think that's maybe what some people don't realize, is that for autistic people who self-identify, it's usually after a very deep, long, intensive process of learning, because of that special interest in the bottom-up processing. So I have mixed feelings about it. I do think these things are really complex, and I do worry that people might self-identify when it's maybe something that kind of has a treatment protocol to it, and where that's the thing that they should be getting support around.
Do you think that online assessments, like the free ones you can do online, are worth taking?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and first of all, I'd call them screeners, because they're not actually assessments, so they're screeners. And I do think they're worth it. And I tell people that is one data point. So I wouldn't take one screener and be like, oh, look, this means I'm autistic. But collecting data points is part of the process of self-discovery. So taking the CAT-Q or the AQ or the RADS, and if all of those are above threshold, and then having conversations with people you trust and listening to autistic adults who are describing the internal experience of being autistic, all of these are part of the data collective process. And screeners can be a really helpful part of that, but it shouldn't be the only thing someone is relying on.
A friend of mine was wondering whether she's autistic, and her friend was trying to convince her that she is. So she took one of these online screeners and got not that high, like below threshold score, saying she's not autistic. And her friend is like, you must have answered the questions wrong. It was like reviewing the responses with her and saying, oh, you didn't answer that one right. I was like, that's not how this works. Yeah, it seems like obviously it's important that people get the right diagnosis, right? If they get the wrong diagnosis, they may get the wrong treatment, which could be bad for them. At the same time, as you point out, not everyone has good access to getting, a formal diagnosis. So we have to keep that in mind. Before we wrap up, the last thing I wanted to ask you about is getting really practical. Suppose someone has an autistic person in their life. What can they do to relate better to that person, to make that person more comfortable, and so on?
Yeah, I think a few things. One thing I talk about a lot is the importance of developing a sensory lens. So all humans have sensory needs. It's just if you're allistic and you don't have a lot of sensory processing differences, you probably just don't think about sensory stuff a lot. So for example, even asking a friend like, hey, do you want to go get coffee, or do you want to go out for a meal, or do you want to go to a movie? Developing a sensory lens helps you think through what are the sensory asks in that? Because that's actually there's a lot of hidden sensory asks in that. So even just developing, or do I wear perfume or cologne when I'm going to see my autistic friend, right? Like that will give me an instant migraine to be around that stuff. So developing a sensory lens, I think, is one of the kindest ways to be inclusive of autistic people in your life. I think another one is around understanding that need for predictability and routine. And so if there's a change of plans and the person has a big response to that, that's not them trying to be difficult. That is their brain frantically trying to adjust. And as much as you can communicate ahead of time around the plans, that's going to be really supportive for that person. I also think understanding the cross-neurotype piece is helpful, that it's not that there's a right and a wrong way to communicate, that these are differences in the same way that in cross-cultural communication, there's differences, and learning about that. I like to talk about object-based for social-based conversation a lot, and that object-based conversation tends to be an easier access point or entry point for us. So that's when we're talking about ideas or objects, or we have a focal point to the conversation. It's not the social-based kind of, how are you? Tell me about yourself type questions. I think that's a really helpful frame of reference to have. So those are a few things that come to mind.
What about being more direct in communication, using less sort of subtlety?
That is very, very helpful. Thanks for adding that one. And also being honest. So if an autistic person asks for feedback, to be honest about that, or to be honest about what you mean. And so, yes, direct communication and then honesty when someone is asking for follow-up information. Or even something like, are you mad at me? Right? And then I think the allistic response often is like, no, I'm not mad at you, is to reassure. But if the autistic person is sensing something, it's actually really helpful to understand what we're sensing.
And what if the listener wonders after hearing this conversation, I wonder if I'm autistic? Where would you recommend they start?
So I actually probably would recommend with some of those online screeners as one of the data points. Embrace Autism is a site that has a lot of those up where you can take them. Also, learning more about the lost generation and the adult experience. I've got a few articles up on Neurodivergent Insights that kind of walks through the experience of the autistic brain style from the lens of an adult. There's a lot of podcasts out there. So Divergent Conversations is a podcast I co-host with another mental health provider. We're both ADHD, so we're both autistic ADHD, and we walk through the experience of autism. We have a series where we go through the autism criteria, and I think that series would actually be a good place to start. I bet a lot of your listeners are pretty academic. So Is This Autism is a really fantastic book by Dr. Donna Henderson and Sarah Whalen, where they walk through the diagnostic criteria with those more nuanced presentations in mind. So those would be kind of finding autistic voices that you trust, taking some screeners, having conversations with people in your life of does this make sense? And gathering information.
And we'll put links to those in the show notes. Final question for you. Do you feel that in some ways your autism gives you a kind of superpower? Because I know that some autistic people feel that way.
Did you see my body response to that? I don't. No, I don't. And the disability justice community has, I think, spoken really well around this of when we start using superpower language, it becomes another way of you as a society can accept me because I have this superpower thing. And I think it really minimizes it can minimize the experience of the challenges of being autistic when we start using superpower rhetoric. I would say there are strengths and challenges of being autistic. And I will talk openly about the challenges of being autistic and the things I grieve about being autistic. I will also talk openly about how much I really love how my mind works. I love that it's this hyperlinked Wikipedia page where I could get lost in ideas all day and be super happy. And it's really hard for me. My experience of the too muchness of the world, my experience of my body is really hard for me. And so it's both strengths and challenges. And I'm nervous of things that make autism all one thing, or that use superpower rhetoric in the same way that I'm nervous about rhetoric that makes autism a tragedy.
Megan, Anna, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.